The village of Neanda was small, tucked away between rolling hills and golden fields of maize. It was a place where everyone knew each other, where the laughter of children filled the air, and where the scent of roasting cassava and freshly drawn water lingered from morning till night. Among its people was Amara, a young woman whose kindness was as well known as the warmth of the morning sun. She was the kind of girl who helped the elders carry their baskets, who braided the little girl's hair in the evening, and who always made sure that no one in the village went hungry. She was loved, admired, and trusted. But her mother worried for her. "Amara," she would say, sitting on their woven mat in the evenings, "you must understand that not all people are good." Amara would smile, resting her head on her mother's lap. "I know, Mama. But our village is safe." Her mother's fingers ran gently through Amara's long, braided hair. "Our village, yes. But the world beyond?" Her voice grew quiet. "That is different." It wasn't the first time Amara had heard these warnings. Since she was a little girl, her mother had spoken of the dangers that lurked beyond the fields, beyond the winding path that led into the deep forest. "Never trust the men who come from outside," she would say. "There are those who smile with kindness but hide shadows behind their eyes." Amara had always nodded, but deep inside, she believed the world was mostly good. How could it not be, when she had known only love and kindness her entire life? One evening, just before sunset, Amara's mother called her inside their hut. "Your grandmother is not well," she said. "She needs fresh food and herbs. I have packed a basket for her." Amara's face brightened. She loved visiting her grandmother, who lived in a neighboring village just beyond the forest. "I will leave right away," she said eagerly. But her mother's expression was uneasy. "You must go quickly, Amara. The night is not safe." "I will be careful, Mama," Amara promised. Her mother placed a firm hand on hers. "Stay on the main path. No matter what, do not take another route." Amara nodded. "I understand." Her mother hesitated, then leaned in, lowering her voice. "And if you meet a stranger, do not trust too easily." There was something heavy in her tone, a weight Amara did not fully understand. But she simply smiled, hugged her mother, and lifted the basket onto her head. "I will be back before the moon rises." And with that, she set off. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows as Amara made her way down the well-trodden path leading to the forest. The leaves rustled gently in the evening breeze, and birds chirped in the trees. She walked with confidence, the basket balanced perfectly on her head, her feet stepping lightly over the dusty trail. The first part of the journey was familiar: the fields, the little river where she and her friends used to play, the towering baobab tree that stood like a guardian at the forest's edge. But as she stepped beneath the dense canopy of trees, the air shifted. The light dimmed as the thick branches intertwined above her. The chirping of the birds grew distant, replaced by the occasional hoot of an unseen owl. The path stretched ahead, winding like a serpent between the trees. Amara inhaled deeply, pushing away the small shiver that ran down her spine. She had walked this path before. There was nothing to fear. And yet, something felt different tonight. As she walked deeper, she became aware of how quiet it was. Too quiet. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She quickened her steps, clutching the basket more tightly. The faster she walked, the heavier the silence became, pressing against her ears like an unseen force. Then, a rustling. Somewhere to her left. She froze, her heart pounding. "Just the wind," she whispered to herself. But her mother's voice echoed in her mind. "Do not trust too easily." For the first time, doubt crept into her heart. Had she truly been safe all along? Or had she simply not noticed the dangers before? Taking a deep breath, she shook her head and pressed forward. She just had to keep walking. She just had to stay on the path. She just had to ignore the feeling that she was no longer alone. Deeper she walked into the forest, the darker it became, the towering trees blocking out the last remnants of sunlight. The wind whispered through the leaves, carrying strange murmurs that sent chills down her spine. She adjusted the basket on her head, forcing herself to focus on the path ahead. The journey to her grandmother's village was one she had made before, but tonight, it felt different. An unfamiliar path. As she walked, she noticed a narrow trail branching off from the main path. It was barely visible, hidden behind a thick cluster of bushes, but something about it caught her eye. She hesitated. The main path was longer, it would take her at least an hour to reach her grandmother's village. But this path? It looked like a shortcut. She glanced up at the sky. The sun had almost disappeared, and the thought of being in the forest after nightfall made her uneasy. Her mother's warning echoed in her mind. Stay on the main path, no matter what. Amara chewed her lip. What was the harm in taking a quicker route? She had been through this forest many times before. She knew its trees, its rivers, its winding roads. And yet, she hesitated for only a moment before stepping onto the new path. It was a mistake. The moment she left the familiar road, the air around her changed. The wind grew stronger, rustling the leaves in a way that almost sounded like voices. The path beneath her feet felt damp, the soil softer than she remembered. She walked faster. The trees grew taller, their branches twisting unnaturally, reaching toward her like fingers. Shadows stretched across the ground, lengthening, shifting with each step she took. The uneasy feeling in her chest deepened. Something wasn't right. She turned to go back, but the path behind her was gone. Panic flared in her chest. Had she taken the wrong turn? Was she walking in circles? She spun around, trying to retrace her steps, but the forest had changed. It was as if it had swallowed the road she had come from. A soft rustling sound came from her right. Then, laughter. Low, murmuring voices. Not the wind. People. The campfire and the strangers. Up ahead, through the thick trees, she saw a faint glow, firelight. Relief flooded her. Someone was nearby. Maybe travelers or hunters. They could help her find her way back. She hurried toward the light, pushing past the dense foliage until she emerged into a small clearing. 3 men sat around a campfire. They looked up as she approached, their faces illuminated by the flickering flames. "Well, what do we have here?" one of them said, his voice smooth but unfamiliar. Amara hesitated. The 3 men were dressed in simple clothes, their feet dusty from travel. They looked like ordinary villagers, but something about the way they stared at her made her stomach twist. I lost my way," she said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I was going to my grandmother's village, but I must have taken the wrong path." The man closest to her stood up. He was tall, his face half hidden in the shadows. "That is unfortunate," he said. "The forest can be tricky at night." Amara nodded. "Yes. Do you know the way to the main path?" The other 2 men exchanged glances. The tallest man smiled. "Why don't you sit for a while? You must be tired." The fire crackled between them, casting eerie shadows on the trees. Amara hesitated. She was tired, and she had been walking for hours. Perhaps sitting down for a moment wouldn't hurt. She took a cautious step forward. False safety. The men made room for her, gesturing for her to sit on a log by the fire. One of them handed her a small wooden cup filled with water. "Drink," he urged. "It will help you relax." Amara accepted it hesitantly. The warmth of the fire against her skin was comforting, and the men smiled at her, their voices gentle as they asked her about her journey. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe that she was safe. But then, she noticed the way one of them watched her too closely. The way another's fingers twitched when she adjusted the cloth on her shoulders. The way the tallest man leaned forward ever so slightly, as if waiting for something. A warning bell rang in her mind. She looked at the water in her hands. Had it always had that strange, bitter scent? Her heart pounded. She couldn't drink it. She set the cup down carefully. "Thank you," she said, forcing a smile. But I should be going now. The men's smiles didn't falter, but something in their eyes changed. The tallest man tilted his head. So soon? Yes, Amara said, rising to her feet. My grandmother is expecting me. One of the men, the one who had been silent until now, stood up slowly, blocking her path. Stay a little longer, he said. His voice was soft, but there was an edge to it. Amara's pulse quickened. I really must go. She took a step back. The tallest man grabbed her wrist. A shock of fear shot through her. Now, he said, his grip tightening. No need to be rude. The other two men stood up. And Amara knew. She had walked into a trap. Amara's heart pounded in her chest as the tallest man's grip tightened around her wrist. The warmth of the fire no longer felt comforting, it felt like a trap. The flickering flames cast shadows on the men's faces, stretching their smiles into something sinister. She should not have come here. She should have stayed on the main path. But now, she was surrounded. The man holding her wrist pulled her back toward the fire with a force that made her stumble. One of the others chuckled under his breath. You're acting nervous, the tallest man said, his voice smooth but laced with something dark. You've been walking all day. Sit, eat. You need your strength. Amara swallowed hard. She needed to think. If she fought now, would she stand a chance? The men were bigger, stronger. If she ran, would she make it before they caught her? Her mother's voice rang in her head. Do not trust too easily. But it was too late for that. Amara forced a small smile. You're right, she said, sitting back down, trying to calm the panic rising inside her. The tallest man let go of her wrist but stayed close. One of the others handed her a piece of roasted meat. Eat. She hesitated. What's wrong? The man beside her asked. You don't trust us? Amara forced a laugh, though her hands trembled as she accepted the food. I do. I'm just not very hungry. She took a small bite, just enough to make it look like she was eating. The meat was tough, salty. It stuck to her throat as she swallowed, her body rejecting it. She needed to stay alert. The men ate greedily, their eyes flicking toward her between bites. She noticed how they sat, too relaxed, too at ease. Like they had already decided what was going to happen. Her stomach turned. She had to leave. Minutes passed, and a strange sensation crept over her. Her arms felt heavy. Her legs, sluggish. A fog settled in her mind, making it difficult to think clearly. Her breathing slowed. No. No. They had done something to the food. Her vision blurred at the edges, her body betraying her as weakness spread through her limbs. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her. She gripped the log she sat on, trying to keep her balance. The men watched her struggle. Smirking. You don't look well, one of them said. Amara opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Her body was shutting down. The attack. Before she could react, the tallest man grabbed her arm again, harder this time. She tried to pull away, but her limbs felt like stone. Panic flooded her chest as she realized what was happening. No, she whispered. The tallest man leaned in close, his breath hot against her ear. You shouldn't have come here alone. The other two men stood, stepping toward her. Her pulse roared in her ears. She thrashed against them, but her movements were slow, uncoordinated. The tallest man pushed her down. She hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. No. She struggled, but she was too weak. Laughter echoed around her. Hands grabbed at her. Ripping. Tearing. Pain. Her screams filled the forest. But no one came. No one heard. No one saved her. When it was over, Amara lay still on the cold ground, her body broken, her spirit shattered. Tears slid silently down her cheeks, soaking into the dirt beneath her. The men sat around the fire once more, speaking in hushed voices. Like nothing had happened. Like she was nothing. Her mind felt distant, as if she were floating somewhere outside of herself. She had always believed the world was good. That people were kind. She had been wrong. One of the men stood and kicked dust toward her, barely sparing her a glance. "Leave her here," he muttered. "She won't survive the night anyway." The others grunted in agreement, their voices dull, uncaring. And then they walked away. Their figures disappeared into the dark forest, their laughter fading into the wind. And Amara? She lay there. Cold. Broken. Alone. The night was cold. The fire had died down, its embers barely flickering in the darkness. The forest stretched endlessly around her, silent and uncaring. Amara lay on the ground, curled in on herself, her body trembling with pain. Every part of her ached, her limbs, her ribs, her face. Even breathing hurt. But nothing compared to the hollow, suffocating weight in her chest. She wanted to move, but she couldn't. She wanted to scream, but what was the point? No one would come. No one had heard her before. She had been left to rot in the wilderness. A sharp jolt of pain brought Amara back to full consciousness. She gasped, her body tensing as she shifted slightly on the hard earth. Every muscle felt torn, her skin raw. The bruises on her arms, her legs, her neck, they burned, screaming with every small movement. She squeezed her eyes shut, hoping, for even a moment, that this was a nightmare. But it wasn't. The rough dirt beneath her, the cold air against her skin, the distant sounds of rustling leaves, they were all real. And so was the pain. Tears slipped down her cheeks as reality sank in. This had happened. To her. And she could never undo it. Laughter echoed in the distance. Not far from where she lay, the three men sat near the dying fire, speaking in low, amused tones. "She didn't even fight that much at the end," one of them scoffed. "Did you see the look in her eyes?" Another chuckled. "Like a scared little animal." A third voice sighed. "We should go. If someone finds her, we don't want to be here." Amara's stomach twisted. Even now, after everything they had done, she was nothing to them. Just a thing to be used and discarded. Her fingers clenched weakly into the dirt. She wanted to hate them, to curse them, to drag herself to her feet and make them pay. But she couldn't even lift her head. She was powerless. And they knew it. Boots crunched against the earth. She felt them moving around her, their presence dark and looming, but she didn't open her eyes. One of them kicked dust toward her. "Let's go," he muttered. "She's done for," another agreed. A pause. Then a careless laugh. "If she survives, maybe someone else will find her and have their fun." More laughter. Then footsteps. Fading. Leaving. Gone. Amara listened to the sound of them disappearing into the trees, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. They were really leaving her. Alone. Helpless. No food. No water. No strength. They had taken everything. And now they expected her to die here. For a long time, she lay still, staring at nothing. The cold crept into her bones, but she didn't move. The world around her felt distant, almost unreal, like she wasn't really there. Maybe she wasn't. Maybe the real Amara had died back there, somewhere between their laughter and her screams. She could stay here. She could close her eyes and let the night take her. It would be easier that way. But then, her mother's face. It flashed in her mind, clear as day. The way she used to hum while braiding Amara's hair. The warmth in her eyes. The way she had warned her, over and over again. "Not all people are good, Amara. You must be careful." Tears slipped down Amara's face. Her mother had tried to protect her. And Amara had been foolish enough to think she was safe. Now she knew the truth. The world was cruel. People were cruel. And if she wanted to survive, if she wanted to see her mother again, she had to move. Even if it hurt. Even if she bled. Even if the forest itself tried to swallow her whole. She had to fight. With every ounce of strength she had left, Amara forced her body to move. She dragged herself forward, inch by inch, through the dirt. Her fingers clawed at the earth, her legs barely responding. Every motion sent fresh waves of agony through her, but she gritted her teeth and kept going. She would not die here. She would not let them win. She would live. Even if it killed her. The night stretched endlessly as Amara crawled forward, her body screaming in pain. Every inch of her was battered, bruised, and broken. The forest loomed around her, dark and indifferent, but she refused to give in to despair. She didn't know how long she had been moving, minutes, hours, maybe longer. But suddenly, beneath her trembling fingers, she felt something different. Wet earth. She lifted her head, and through the thick foliage ahead, she saw it, a river. Its waters shimmered faintly under the moonlight, winding through the forest like a silver serpent. The sight of it sent a wave of desperation through her. Water. She could wash away the filth, the touch, the scent of those men. She could cleanse herself. She dragged herself forward with the last of her strength until she reached the riverbank. Amara plunged her hands into the cold water, scrubbing at her skin, her nails digging into her flesh as if she could erase what had been done to her. She cupped the water in her hands and splashed it onto her face, gasping at the shock of it. She scrubbed at her arms, her legs, her neck, anywhere they had touched her. But no matter how hard she tried, she still felt dirty. Tears mixed with the water as she let out a broken sob. Why had this happened to her? What had she done to deserve this? She lowered her hands into the river again, watching the ripples distort her reflection. The girl staring back at her was someone she no longer recognized, her face hollow, her eyes empty. She had lost something tonight. And she would never get it back. You are not the first to weep in these waters. Amara's entire body froze. The voice was soft but strong, carrying the weight of something ancient. Slowly, Amara turned her head. Standing a few feet away, half hidden by the trees, was an old woman. Her skin was dark as the earth, lined with deep wrinkles that spoke of countless years. Her long, silver hair was braided and adorned with tiny bones and beads that clicked softly as she moved. She wore a flowing robe made of woven fibers, blending into the shadows of the forest. Her eyes, piercing and knowing, studied Amara in silence. Amara's throat tightened. Who was this woman? Had she been watching her this whole time? Fear prickled at the back of her neck. The woman stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, like the shifting of the wind. You seek to wash away what has been done, she murmured, her voice like a whisper in the trees. Amara flinched. The woman's gaze seemed to cut through her, as if she could see everything. Shame burned in Amara's chest. She lowered her head. I just want to be clean. The woman sighed. Child, the water can only cleanse the body. But the wound they left is deeper than the skin. Amara squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears falling. Then what do I do? She whispered. The woman knelt beside her, dipping her hand into the river. The water swirled around her fingers, moving unnaturally, as if it recognized her touch. You listen, the woman said softly. For the land has already heard your cries. The wind shifted, rustling the leaves. Amara's skin prickled with a sudden awareness. The river. The trees. The earth beneath her. It was as if the entire forest was watching. The old woman lifted her wet fingers and let the droplets fall back into the river. This land is not deaf to suffering. It does not forget cruelty. The blood that stains it calls out for justice. Amara's breath hitched. She thought of the men. Their laughter. Their hands. The way they had left her for dead. A slow, cold anger coiled in her chest. The old woman turned to her. Do you wish for vengeance, child? Amara shivered. The question was heavy, dangerous. She should have said no. She should have wished to forget. But instead, she nodded. The old woman smiled, but it was not a kind smile. It was knowing. It was final. Then the forest will give them what they deserve. The river stilled, its surface unnaturally smooth. The wind stopped. The trees no longer swayed. It was as if the very land was listening. The woman placed a hand on Amara's head, her touch surprisingly warm. Rest, child. The hunt has already begun. Amara's vision blurred. Her body, exhausted beyond its limits, could fight no more. As she slumped forward, darkness took her. And in the silence of the forest, something stirred. The three men walked through the darkened forest, their laughter still lingering in the air like a bitter echo. They had taken what they wanted, left her for dead, and moved on without a second thought. To them, Amara was nothing more than a fading memory. The tallest man, Django, walked ahead, his broad shoulders relaxed, his hands swinging easily at his sides. Behind him, Baraka and Omar carried on their conversation as if nothing had happened. She was weak, Baraka muttered, kicking a loose stone from the path. Didn't even fight after a while. Omar scoffed. What did you expect? Women like that? A gust of wind rushed through the trees, cutting him off. It was strong, too strong. The firelight from their torches flickered wildly, the trees groaning as the wind passed through. Django stopped. His jaw clenched. Omar frowned. What was that? Just the wind, Django muttered. But deep in his chest, something uneasy stirred. The men continued walking, but the forest had changed. The trees looked taller, their trunks stretching unnaturally high. The once clear path now seemed narrower, winding in ways that made no sense. And the whispers. Soft, almost inaudible at first. But growing. Low voices, murmuring in a language they did not understand, curling through the air like unseen fingers. Baraka paused, his face pale. Did you hear that? Omar smirked. Scared already? Baraka swallowed hard. I swear I heard something. Django clenched his fists. It's just the wind, he repeated, though his voice was not as sure as before. But as they walked deeper, the voices grew louder. Soft, breathless whispers, weaving through the trees, carried by the wind. Their words impossible to understand. But the meaning was clear. They were being watched. Omar was the first to disappear. One moment, he was walking behind them, chuckling at Baraka's fear. The next, silence. Django and Baraka turned, expecting to see Omar's smirking face. But he was gone. Baraka's breath hitched. Omar? Nothing. Django scowled. Omar, if you're playing games. A sound. A soft splash. Both men turned toward the noise, and through the shifting shadows, they saw it. The river. Its waters were eerily still, as if waiting. And at its edge, something floated just beneath the surface. Baraka took a shaky step forward. Then another. When he saw Omar's lifeless face staring up from the water, his mouth opened in a silent scream, he stumbled backward, retching. No, he gasped. Django's breath came in sharp bursts, his chest tightening. What, how did he? He turned in all directions, his eyes scanning the trees. Nothing. No signs of a struggle. No tracks leading to the water. Omar had simply vanished and appeared dead. Baraka's hands trembled. This isn't right. Django swallowed hard, his mind racing. The whispers around them were growing. And now, they were laughing. They ran. Django didn't care where they went. He just knew they had to get out of the forest. Baraka panted beside him, his hands shaking as he clutched his chest. The whispers followed them. Closer. Louder. The torches in their hands flickered violently, the fire dimming as if being smothered by unseen hands. Then, Baraka screamed. Django spun around, his blood turning to ice. Baraka stood frozen, his eyes wide in terror. Behind him, just beyond the trees, figures moved. Dark shapes. Unseen, yet present. Baraka staggered backward, his body shaking. No. No. Django grabbed his arm. Keep moving. Baraka nodded, his breath ragged. They ran again, but the forest never ended. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly, twisting in on themselves. No matter which direction they went, the path kept leading them back to the river. Baraka clutched his head, his voice breaking. This isn't real. This isn't real. Django grabbed him roughly. Listen to me. But Baraka's eyes suddenly widened. His breath hitched. Django frowned. What? Baraka's lips trembled. She's here. Django turned just in time to see the trees move. A shadowed figure, standing at the edge of the river, watching them. Her hair, once neatly braided, hung in wild strands around her bruised face. Her skin was streaked with dried blood, her clothes tattered and torn. Yet her eyes. They burned. Django's throat tightened. Amara? She tilted her head. The wind howled. The whispers screamed. The forest came alive. And in the chaos, Baraka's scream was the last thing Django heard. The forest was alive. The whispers had grown into a chorus of voices, rising and falling like a storm, wrapping around Django and Baraka as they ran blindly through the trees. The air was thick, suffocating, as if the land itself was closing in on them. Django's breath came in ragged gasps, his legs burning from exhaustion. His hands were slick with sweat, his mind racing with thoughts of escape. But deep down, he knew. There was no escaping this. The forest was punishing them. For what they had done. For what they had taken. And it would not let them go. Baraka tripped. Django heard his strangled gasp as he hit the ground with a heavy thud. He turned back, reaching for him. Get up. Baraka groaned, his fingers clawing at the dirt, his body trembling. Django bent down to grab him. And then Baraka was lifted off the ground. Django froze. It happened too fast. Baraka's body was yanked upward by an invisible force, his arms flailing, his legs kicking desperately. His screams echoed through the trees as he was pulled higher and higher, until his figure disappeared into the darkness above. Django's stomach twisted in horror. Baraka. Silence. The only sound was the wind, whispering through the leaves. Then, a creaking noise. Django's heart slammed against his ribs. He stepped back, his breath caught in his throat. Baraka's lifeless body dangled from a thick branch above, his head twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes were still open, frozen in pure terror. Django stumbled backward, his entire body shaking. No, 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 no. His breath came in sharp gasps as his mind screamed at him to run. But where? The forest had trapped him. And now, he was the last one left. Django ran blindly, his feet slipping over roots and rocks, his vision blurred by panic. He didn't care where he was going. He just knew he had to get away. But no matter how far he ran, the whispers followed. They were inside his head, crawling under his skin, pulling at the edges of his sanity. The wind screamed around him. Shadows moved in the corners of his vision. Then, a voice. Soft. Familiar. Django. He stopped. His breath hitched in his throat. Slowly, he turned. She stood behind him. Amara. Or, what was left of her. Her bruised skin glowed faintly in the darkness, her torn clothes fluttering as if touched by a breeze only she could feel. But it was her eyes that terrified him most. They were hollow. Empty. And yet, somehow, filled with something far worse than rage. Judgment. Django staggered back. No, no, you're dead. We left you. His voice caught in his throat. Amara took a step forward. Django's body locked in place. His feet wouldn't move. His hands wouldn't respond. His entire body betrayed him. The whispers around him grew louder. The wind howled. And then, darkness swallowed him whole. The village never saw Django again. But they heard him. On quiet nights, when the wind blew just right, his voice drifted through the trees, a whispering cry, calling for help. But no one dared answer. No one dared step foot into the forest. Because they all knew. The land had delivered its justice. And it never forgot. The forest had claimed its vengeance. The men who had wronged her were gone, their fates whispered among the trees, their screams swallowed by the wind. But Amara still remained. Barely. Her body was weak, her wounds still raw. She had spent days drifting between consciousness and the dark abyss of pain. The spirits had cradled her in the shadows, whispering to her, keeping her alive just enough. But not whole. Never whole again. And that was how the traveler found her. The man was a simple herdsman, traveling between villages with his cattle when he noticed something in the distance near the riverbank. A figure. At first, he thought it was a trick of the mist, a shadow cast by the trees. But as he stepped closer, his breath caught in his throat. It was a girl. She was lying at the water's edge, her body half submerged, her once vibrant dress torn and stained with dirt and dried blood. Her braids were undone, strands of hair clinging to her hollow cheeks. She looked lifeless. But then, she moved. A slow, fragile breath. Her eyes flickered open, unfocused, distant. The traveler hesitated. There was something unnatural about her. But he couldn't leave her. So, with careful hands, he lifted her broken body and carried her back to the village. When the traveler arrived at Nyanda, carrying Amara in his arms, the villagers stared in horror. "She's alive," someone whispered. "But how? We thought she was. She should be dead." The murmurs spread quickly. Women gasped, elders shook their heads in disbelief, and children hid behind their mothers' skirts, peeking at the girl who had once been so full of life. But Amara was no longer the girl they remembered. She did not smile. She did not weep. She did not speak. She simply existed. Her mother ran to her, falling to her knees, pulling her into a desperate embrace. But Amara did not react. She only blinked, her eyes dark, empty, like she was looking at something no one else could see. The elders called for a healer, but the woman only shook her head after examining her. "There is no medicine for this," she murmured. "Whatever happened to her, it is not of this world." The village was silent. Amara had returned. But she had not come back alone. Time passed, but Amara never truly healed. She moved through the village like a shadow, her steps soundless, her presence unsettling. She no longer laughed, no longer played with the children, no longer braided the girl's hair in the evenings. Instead, she sat by the river, staring at the water for hours, as if listening to something only she could hear. People whispered. "She walks between two worlds now." She was touched by the spirits. She is neither dead nor alive. And perhaps they were right. For sometimes, when the wind blew through the village, carrying the rustling of leaves and the distant echoes of whispers from the forest, Amara would smile. A slow, knowing smile. And the villagers would shiver. Because they all knew. The land never forgot. And neither did she.